Hi class. In this lecture, I will review some pharmacy basics. This content is a really background information for the pharmacology course. We have assigned some chapters for you to read for this content. However, I think if you listen to this lecture, that should be sufficient. If I were you, I would only read the chapters if you feel like you'd like more detail. But if you listen to this content and this lecture, I think you'll be just fine in terms of grasping this background information. So these are the vocabulary words for this module. You can find definitions for these in the text if you'd like. The objectives are listed. They're also listed in your Blackboard module for this content. So let's get started. So the next several slides, as I mentioned, is really just a review of some basic information about drugs. I do think that patients could occasionally ask questions of you about these types of topics, especially since as nurses, you are frequently the ones fielding a lot of questions from patients. So I think it makes sense for you to have a nice background in some of these kind of overview topics. So let's get started. We'll talk about the new drug development process. So I have some of the major legislation regarding pharmaceuticals listed on this slide. Now obviously this is not an all-encompassing list. Over the last century, there's been increasing control exerted over the pharmaceutical industry, and in many cases, the legislation, particularly the legislation in the early 1900s, was the result of patients experiencing harm from medications. For the most part, increased regulation has actually been very beneficial for patients. It's resulted in safer and more effective drugs available on the market for treating patients. So some of the specific legislation, so the first act that you see there, the Federal Pure Food and Drug Act, was signed into law in 1906. This law was all about establishing quality and purity standards for medications with respect to what the label says is in the product and what is actually in the product. So what that means is that the label in the product needs to indicate exactly what's contained in the bottle. If there are any deviations from that, it has to be listed on the bottle. That seems kind of like a no-brainer, but prior to 1906, it wasn't actually required. It wasn't the law. In 1938, so some 30 years later, the first ever drug safety legislation came to be, and that was with the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. Sadly, this act was in response to a tragedy where more than 100 patients died, and that was because they were prescribed an antibiotic called sulfanilamide. Unfortunately, that antibiotic contained an excipient, which is an inactive ingredient, and that particular excipient was diethylene glycol, which is kind of like antifreeze. And so that antibiotic had that excipient ingredient in it, and unfortunately, it led to the death of lots of patients. So as a result of that tragedy, this law was established, and actually part of this law was to establish the FDA, which I'm sure you all have heard of, which is the Food and Drug Administration. As part of this law, drugs were required to be tested for safety before approval for marketing in the United States. So this was the first time that it was required that drugs actually be proven safe before they're marketed to patients. So again, about 30 years after that law, there was an amendment to that act, which was the 1962 Harris-Kefauver Amendment. And in this amendment, it was required that drugs be shown that they're effective. So, in 1938, it was the first time that drugs had to be proven safe. In 1962, first time that drugs had to be proven that they actually worked. And again, this amendment was in response to another tragedy. So this tragedy did not happen in the United States, but it did happen in Europe. And basically a drug called thalidomide, which was a drug that was used to treat nausea, was prescribed to pregnant patients. And pregnant patients who used the drug an overwhelming majority of those patients ended up delivering babies who had a major birth defect called phycomelia, which causes gross malformations, particularly of the arms and legs. And in most patients, these babies would be born literally without arms or without legs or both. And so, as a result of that tragedy, it was the first time in the United States that it was an actual requirement that drugs be proven effective in the population that they'll be used in, and then, of course, safe for that population as well. And really, this is where the new drug development approval process was born as a result of that legislation. I'll talk about the new drug development approval process in a few moments. Very quickly, a couple other pieces of legislation that bear mentioning. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970. This was in response to growing problems with drugs of abuse. And this law established rules for manufacturing, prescribing, and distributing medications that had the potential for abuse. Actually has quite, as a result of this law, there are actually some practice implications really for anybody who touches the medication use process, but certainly for nurses. So in terms of handling these medications, there are lots of rules that guide the handling of those medications. Let me skip down to the two PEDS Acts, the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children's Act and the Pediatric Research Equity Act. Both of these acts were signed into law in the 2000s, and these had a focus on pediatric medications. Both laws were designed to promote much needed research on drug efficacy and safety in children. For the first act, the BPCA of 2002, this allowed drugs that were studied in kids to get an extra 6 months of patent exclusivity, which actually translates to lots of money for the drug manufacturers. So you can see why that might be enticing to them. And then the second act required testing if drugs were expected to be used in kids. So these were really big landmark laws that helped for sure in the pediatric population. Going back up to the Prescription Drug User Fee Act of 1992, that drug really helped certain populations by creating an accelerated approval process, specifically for patients who had HIV or cancer. Those drugs weren't getting to market quickly enough to be beneficial in some of those patients. So this law actually helped to accelerate the approval process for those medications. As I mentioned, there are lots of other legislations that are important for pharmaceuticals, but I think these are the big ones. I think these are the most important. I really do think that having just a basic knowledge of these really gives you as a nurse some basic insight into what's required from a regulatory standpoint before drugs can be marketed in the United States. So in terms of the approval process, you all may have seen a depiction of this process before. Hopefully you have, but if not, that's okay. I'm going to walk you through it. Basically, what you see kind of going from the left to the right of the screen is really kind of a timeline of the drug approval process. The first couple years of the process are really just trying to identify a compound that could potentially be effective. These are in vitro studies, so these are happening in the lab, not happening in humans or animals at that point. Once they discover a potential compound, then that compound is going to be tested in animal models for the next several years, looking for things such as efficacy, selectivity, how the drug works, potential side effects, things of that nature. Once the drug is shown to have potential for effectiveness and safety in animal models, and then of course that potential for human models, then the drug company will file an investigational new drug application, which is called an IND, and that's really kind of around year 4 when that would happen. And after that's approved, that's when the drug can actually undergo clinical testing in human patients. So there are 3 phases typically to the clinical testing process. Phase 1 is where the compound is tested in healthy subjects, and really the point of that testing is to see, is it safe, to get a feel for what the pharmacokinetics of the drug is. We're going to talk a whole lot about pharmacokinetics in our very first lecture, but pharmacokinetics is just how the body acts on the drug. So what the body does to the drug, how it gets the body out of the drug, how it gets the drug out of the body, and so forth. So that's really in a small number of patients. Once the drug is shown to be safe at least in that small population of patients, they move into phase 2, which is where you're going to study the medication in several hundred patients. And at that point, the drug company is looking to assess efficacy. So does it work? Does it actually treat whatever the underlying illness is? And then finally, in phase 3, the drug is tested in a much broader population. Patients who have the disease but have also may have other comorbidities, a variety of different patient types, different genders, different ages, and so forth. And then once the phase 3 marketing is complete, the new drug application is filed. The FDA reviews all of the information up to that point. At that point, there's at least 8, maybe 9, maybe even 10 years worth of data on that medication. And then if all goes well, the drug is approved. Once the drug is approved, it goes to market. And for probably the next 10 years or so, give or take, depending on the medication and the length of the process, the particular drug manufacturer has an exclusive patent on that drug, and they're the only one that can produce it. During that time, phase 4 studies are expected to be completed by the manufacturer, and those are called post-marketing studies, where the manufacturer may potentially look at other populations where the drug might be useful. The manufacturers are also responsible for collecting post-marketing surveillance reports. So healthcare practitioners and others who make reports about problems with the medication, the manufacturers are supposed to evaluate that information as well. Around year 20, that's usually when the patent will expire. And after that point, if there are other companies out there that would like to produce that drug, they can then file with the FDA what's known as an abbreviated drug application to begin producing generic products. So you can see this process is expensive. It's a 10 plus year process just to get the drug to market. It's very lengthy. I think my question for you guys, as you've just kind of heard me describe that process, clearly, I think effectiveness is established. Basically throughout that process, you're establishing that the drug's effective. If the studies show that it's not effective, it's probably not going to get approved. But I guess my question for you guys is, how about safety? So we've studied the patient in, at this point, several thousand patients before it goes to market. Do we think that that we can say unequivocally that the drug is safe? So think about that for a moment. And I want you to think about why or why not. Why would you say, if you think yes, the drug is safe, think about why it's safe. Think about kind of some rationale why you would support that statement. If it's not safe, kind of think about some reasons why you think that might not be the case. So hopefully, as you were thinking through that question that I just posed, hopefully a lot of you thought, well, it's been at least in several thousand patients, it's been shown to be safe. But if you think of that number of patients in relative to the number of people who will ultimately use the medications, it's kind of a small number, right? If there are any uncommon adverse effects, maybe an adverse effect that only happens in 1 out of every 10,000 patients or 1 out of every 100,000 patients, what's the likelihood that that adverse effect is going to be detected when you're studying it in a population of just maybe 1,000, even up to maybe 5,000 or 6,000 patients? It's probably not very likely. If you think about clinical trial design, we would say that for the most part, the way that those studies are designed and the number of patients that that drug is tested in, it's probably not powered really to detect that particular uncommon adverse effect. So that is a risk associated with using new drugs. I heard the statement, and it's actually listed in your book as well, be neither the first to adopt the new nor the last to abandon the old. And I think really, what that's kind of getting at is that you have to really balance the potential benefits of a new medication against the potential risks that some of those really uncommon and potentially serious adverse effects may not have been recognized yet. And it could be your patient that experiences one of those adverse effects. So the point here is that when you're administering a drug that's very new to market, making sure you're monitoring your patients very closely, obviously for the adverse effects that you're familiar with or those that are listed in the drug information references, but also for something that may not be listed, something that, just may not have come to light yet regarding that drug. Now, in addition to just the general fact that these initial studies are definitely underpowered to detect some of these uncommon adverse effects, some of the other issues, special populations aren't always represented in those pre-marketing trials. So, women of childbearing age, historically, these women were included. In the late 70s, rules changed, and the FDA really did start requiring that women and men were equally represented if that drug was expected to be used in both populations. But, just kind of self-selection, women that are expecting to become pregnant may not enroll in clinical trials that are, for pre-marketed drugs. Children, again, the manufacturer may not study the drug in children. If the drug is expected to be used in children because of some of that legislation from the early 2000s, they do have to do that. But, they may not expect that there's a use in children. However, after the drug comes on the market, it doesn't mean that prescribers won't use it in children. So, in the trials, they may not have been adequately represented. Transgender patients, there's a lot that's, being learned about patients that are transgender. There could be different issues with how they respond to drugs based on hormone therapies and such. So really, we're really just starting to get good information about some of these different populations. And then, of course, the elderly population, again, may or may not be included in some of those studies. So making sure that when you're administering medications that are newly marketed, you're really looking out for potential adverse effects, both the ones that we know about and then, of course, anything new that could pop up. And here's, this is kind of the proof in the pudding right here. This table is in your book. It's in chapter 3. This table just describes several drugs that were withdrawn from the U.S. market for safety reasons after they were approved to be marketed in the United States. Many of these drugs were on the market for several years, and patients died as a result of very serious yet uncommon adverse effects. So it does happen that these serious adverse effects kind of wave their ugly heads after the drug is used in lots and lots of people. So that's kind of an overview of the drug development process. Let's move on to how drugs are classified. And there are a couple of different ways that drugs are classified. We'll talk about the basic ways that we classify medications. All right, so first of all, how are drugs named? I think that's probably the most basic place to start. There technically are 3 names for all drugs: the chemical name, the generic name, and the trade name. Don't worry about the chemical name. Without a doubt, I will not be talking about this. In fact, even I am a pharmacist. Most pharmacists don't even know the chemical name for drugs. Usually that's really something that's used in the pharmaceutical industry. In the healthcare industry, we really use the generic name and the trade name. One isn't necessarily better than the other. As a pharmacist, I might argue that it's important to always use the generic name. I know in practice, when you guys get out on your clinicals, you're going to see that in practice, a lot of people use exclusively the trade name. I think a lot of that has to do with the trade name just being easier to say in many cases, easier to remember. The generic names tend to be a little bit more chemical based. But it is wise, I would say, to use the generic names, at least to be familiar with the generic names, because there's only one generic name for every drug. However, the trade names, there could be multiple trade names for a particular drug, especially for OTC products. Sometimes drugs that are marketed in the U.S. versus those marketed outside of the U.S., such as in Canada, in Europe, in other parts of the world, they can have a completely different trade name. So if you have international patients that you're taking care of and you're using a trade name, that could be a totally different drug in their country. So again, kind of being familiar with both the generic and trade is probably very important. I think OTC products are probably the ones where, at least in the US, where we have the most difficulty in terms of drugs having multiple trade names. In fact, here's a great example, kaopectate. I'm sure you guys have heard of kaopectate before. Most people, when they think of kaopectate, they think of an anti-diarrhea medication. It's been around forever. In fact, as long as I've been a pharmacist, kaopectate has been a medication prescribed for treating diarrhea. However, several years ago, around 2005, kaopectate bought a product that was used for constipation. So the company the company that produces kaopectate bought Surfac, which was a stool softener, and they rebranded the product, and it was now also called kaopectate. Now you can see it clearly says on the product stool softener, and the product on the left clearly says for diarrhea. But patients don't always read labels, just like healthcare professionals don't always read labels. You see kaopectate, that's what stands out. You grab it thinking that's going to, cure your diarrhea. Unfortunately, if you grab the stool softener, you're certainly not going to have relief, or your patient's certainly not going to have relief. So, these problems with trade names, especially for the OTC products, can really be a problem. So you have to be real careful when you're using the trade names. All right, so let's move on to the types of medications. So this really goes beyond naming, and really we'll get more into what are the different types of medications that are on the market. The first type I'm going to talk about are what are known as complementary and alternative medicines, or for short, CAMs. I will refer to these medications throughout the class as CAMs. So CAMs are not considered drugs by the FDA. Rather, these are considered dietary supplements. So what that means is that they are not required to go through the strict regulatory process that drugs are required to go through. So all that legislation I talked about earlier, that does not apply to CAM products because they're just considered dietary supplements. On the products, they have to say this product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. And that's kind of the way of getting around, for a patient, for a manufacturer, that's their way of kind of getting around the fact that, well, this really isn't a drug. We're not really claiming that this is going to treat or cure or prevent any problems. But you could try it out and see if it potentially works. I think from a safety perspective, the problem with CAMs as a pharmacist and for you guys as future nurses, I think the problem we should have with these is that they do not have to be proven safe before they're marketed. Kind of the going thought process for these is that they're safe until they're proven hazardous. So they're safe, but once there are reports to the FDA that there's a problem with these, that's when someone goes back and says, hey, we might need to take this off the market because it's not safe. I think that's a problem. Additionally, they don't have to undergo quality certification. Well, actually, let me restate that. The FDA does require that these medications undergo quality certification, and so what that means is what the label says is in the bottle is actually what's in the bottle. The problem with this is that the FDA just doesn't have the manpower to enforce it. So this is a relatively new regulation. I think the late 2000s was when these drugs were first required to undergo quality certification, but there's just not the manpower at the FDA to really enforce this. So unfortunately, there certainly are a lot of products out there on the market that the label may say one thing, but what's in the bottle is something totally different. And then finally, the absolute most serious problem with CAMs is that they can cause serious drug-drug interactions with, either foods that the patient's eating or other drugs that the patient's prescribed. And so that's something that you guys absolutely have to know. If you have a patient that's on a complementary and alternative medication and they're starting a new drug, your first thought needs to be, well, wait a minute, does this interact with any of the medications that they're prescribed, any other complementary and alternative medications they may be taking, and so forth. So this is a really important part of your intake when you see new patients, making sure that you're not only asking about what medications they're on or what drugs they're on, but also if they're taking any, you could call them dietary supplements, herbal supplements, alternative medications. These are all different ways of referring to CAMs. Some of the ones you may see in practice. So on the left side of the screen, black cohosh, coenzyme Q10, echinacea, garlic, ginkgo biloba, St. John's wort, valerian root. You've probably heard of these before. I see commercials for these all the time. Some of the ones that I think you should know that can be very harmful, you should absolutely avoid these at all costs. You should counsel your patients to avoid these at all costs. Comfrey, kava, Muahang. In fact, I'll tell you, over at Johns Hopkins Hospital, the three that I have listed on the right, they are not allowed to be used in the inpatient setting at Johns Hopkins Hospital because they're considered so potentially harmful to the patient. Now, just so you guys know, I did have some reading associated with CAMs. It's one of the last chapters in the book. I think it's chapter 146, but please check your Blackboard module to verify that. Just so you know, at this point in time, really what I want you to know is the previous slide, basically that the drugs can be harmful, they can cause drug interactions, that safety is not guaranteed with these medications, and so forth. Also on this slide, you should be familiar with some of the commonly used CAMs and the ones that should be avoided at all costs. I think that's really all you need to know at this point. What we plan to do as we talk about different disease states, we'll pull in some of these CAMs that would be used for treating those specific disease states. For example, St. John's wort is sometimes used to treat depression. So when we talk about depression and drugs that are used to treat depression, we'll also talk about St. John's wort. All right, so moving on to the next type of drugs, that would be over-the-counter drugs. These are regulated drugs. So they do not require a prescription. However, they are regulated by the FDA. So the difference between these drugs and drugs that do require a prescription, which we'll talk about in a few moments, is that these drugs are really aimed at providing symptomatic relief for patients. So they're not treating some underlying cause, they're just kind of treating a symptom. But like I said, they're still FDA regulated. They have to be shown to be safe and effective. They have to be shown that harmful side effects when used properly, meaning when the patient follows the directions on the box, that they shouldn't cause harmful side effects when they're used properly, that they're not habit forming, that they don't require a professional with specific expertise to figure out when and how to use the medication. So what I mean by that, patient has a headache. They don't need a doctor to say they have a headache, or a nurse practitioner to diagnose that they have a headache. The patient can self-diagnose that they have a headache. So they don't require that professional expertise to figure out what the problem is. It's essentially something that the patient can figure out on their own, and then they can, select the appropriate over-the-counter product to help treat that particular problem. So I do want to mention a couple things with OTC products. First of all, OTC drugs account for 60% of all doses of medications administered in the United States. So that means that more patients use OTC drugs than prescription drugs. 40% of Americans take at least one OTC drug every couple days. That's a lot of OTC products. 4 times as many illnesses are treated by a consumer using over-the-counter products as a consumer visiting a physician. And finally, Americans spend about $20 billion a year on over-the-counter products. You guys may think, why am I saying all of these statistics? Why am I mentioning this to you? I think the main thing is, when you're taking care of patients, it's so common for especially for nurses and pharmacists and prescribers and others working in the inpatient setting and even the outpatient setting, to just focus on prescription drugs and not really ask questions about over-the-counter drugs. And if you've got a sense for how common over-the-counter drug use is, I think that really will help you in your practice to kind of keep over-the-counter products at the forefront of your mind. And like I mentioned for the CAM products, making sure when you're doing medication reconciliation or when you're doing intake and you're interviewing your patient, making sure you're asking not just about their prescription drug use, but also about any over-the-counter products they're using, as well as any complementary and alternative medications. I have to quickly mention, I saw a study that was published recently. It was with medical interns, and these guys were just out of medical school, their first year in their residency, and they were doing a simulation case where they had a child that was presenting with overdose of Tylenol. And interestingly, in that simulation, 85% of the medical students never asked the patient about OTC medication use. Which is interesting because in the case, the source of the Tylenol overdose was over-the-counter medication use. So again, just kind of going back to really putting OTC medication use at the forefront of your mind, particularly when you were, first encountering patients. All right, so let's move on to prescription medications. This is really the bulk of what we're going to talk about in this course, clearly. So these are drugs that require a prescription from a licensed prescriber. In the inpatient setting, just so you know, your OTCs, now while in the outpatient setting, these do not require a prescription. In the inpatient setting, you are going to need an order from a prescriber in order to administer most of those medications. I got to tell you, there are lots of different ways to categorize these medications, the prescription medications in particular. We're going to categorize them by drug class, and that's really how we'll discuss and refer to them. Sometimes we can talk about them by indication, whether or not they're marketed or whether they're approved, whether they're controlled substances, whether they're not controlled substances. But really the way we'll present them, we'll talk about a disease state, and then we'll talk about the different drug classes that can be used for that particular disease state. Now, sometimes when we're talking about medications, we'll talk about some that are experimental or pre-marketed. You're not going to have to memorize obviously any of those, but I may mention them for specific disease states. And then, of course, controlled substances. So when we're going through the drug classes, if there are specific medications that are controlled substances, I will indicate that because that's very important for you to know as a practicing nurse. So controlled substances. I mentioned earlier that the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 was really born as a result of increasing issues with drugs of abuse. And so the law or the act was really aimed at reducing the chances that drugs originating from legitimate sources would be diverted to abusers. That's the point of the law. It's enforced by the Drug Enforcement Agency or the DEA. They only deal with medications that are considered controlled substances. They do also enforce laws related to illegal drugs as well. And the reason why I'm bringing this up for you guys is that there are lots of requirements that are in place as a result of the Controlled Substances Act. Requirements around record keeping, prescribing, labeling. The schedule system was created as a result of this Controlled Substances Act. And so it is going to impact your practice as a nurse. How you maintain chain of custody, things like that, impacts how the pharmacist can dispense. I can personally tell you about a story when I was a new pharmacist. I had a nurse calling from the ICU and telling me, she needed her fentanyl drip right away, which was understandable because, it was a patient in the ICU. And I was so intent on getting it to the nurse as soon as possible that I just put it in the tube and sent it up. And then I got a phone call a few minutes later. Who sent the fentanyl in the tube? You're never allowed to do that. And then, I realized, oh no, that was me. I was a little embarrassed because, you can't send controlled substances through the tube system, obviously, because there's no chain of custody. So those are things that we hand deliver, we get signatures for, things like that. So there are quite a few requirements, and as you guys are out on your clinicals, you'll start to become more and more familiar with those requirements. This is the listing of the different schedules. You do not need to know this in detail. This is really informational. But what I do think is important to understand is Schedule 1 is the most restricted up to Schedule 5, which is the least restricted. And that has to do with the potential for abuse of the medication. So let's talk about dosage forms, and then we'll finish up with drug information resources. So dosage forms. Dosage forms are the means by which the drug entity itself is delivered to the body. The reason that we need lots of different dosage forms is because depending on the drug, we may or may not be able to provide an accurate dose. So the dose may be so small that if you couldn't even formulate it as an oral medication. It could only be formulated as an IV product. Or maybe the drug needs to be protected. So maybe we put an a coating on it so that it bypasses the acid of the stomach and makes its way to the intestine where it can be properly dissolved in a basic environment. Could be that we want to mask the taste and or odor of the medication. Maybe it tastes really bad, so we formulate it as a liquid with a really sweet vehicle. That way the patient doesn't taste the very bad taste of the medication. Maybe we want to extend the effects of the medication. So you'll see that some medications, particularly oral medications, we can formulate them so that you don't have to give them 5 or 6 times a day. They're formulated such that the tablet releases the dose over an entire 24-hour period. Sometimes it's that we want to optimize the drug action at the site where it's going to actually exert its effect. For example, inhalation medications. We want those to act in the lung, but we don't want them to cause systemic side effects. So inhalation dosage forms help achieve that. Maybe we want to ease the administration. I think patch or transdermal systems are good examples of that, where the patient has to put one patch on a week. It's a pretty easy way to administer the medication. And finally, we might want to minimize adverse effects. Lots of different ways that dosage forms that can be utilized to do that. So as I go through talking about specific drugs, some of these topics will continue to come back up. I'll talk about, well, this drug is formulated as a transdermal patch, and, number one, that makes it easier for the patient to take the medication, but also it could potentially minimize adverse effects because there's no GI absorption, maybe something like that. The way that the dosage forms are classified is by their route. So are they oral, topical, rectal, parenteral, etc.? And then also their physical form. Is it a solid? Is it a liquid? And so forth. In your Module 1, I have a chart. It's the dosage form reference. I want you guys to look it over. Again, this is background information for this course. I guarantee that this dosage form reference is something that you'll find useful kind of going forward when you're out on your clinicals. You do not need to memorize it for exam 1. However, I have highlighted probably, I would say maybe 5 to 10 items on the chart. I have highlighted those. Those are important to be familiar with for the first exam. I just think overall it's a great reference. The chart, it's not all routes and dosage forms, but it's the ones that I think 95% of the time you may see. I also focus on the ones that are administered by nurses. So for example, nurses generally don't administer intrathecal medications, so I don't have those listed. But I do think you guys will find it useful. As you look it over, if you have some advice or feedback for me about this dosage form reference, please feel free to email me. I'd love to hear that. All right, so I just want to leave you with a couple take-home points regarding the dosage forms. First of all, route impacts absorption. So the dose that a medication formulated as an oral medication could be very different from the dose, that same exact drug that's formulated as an IV medication. We'll talk a lot more about that in our very first lecture on pharmacology. The dosage form also impacts absorption. So again, the way the dose itself is formulated, the product is formulated, that could also impact absorption. Modified release products. So those products where, rather than the drug being released all at once, one of those drugs that could release over 24 hours, those usually cannot be crushed or cut or broken in any way. Always check the do not cut list or prior to cutting or crushing or smashing those medications. Sometimes patients can't take a whole tablet and they'll ask, can you crush it for them? You really do need to check that list, and that's also posted in Module 1. Some other important points. Intramuscular forms of medication are not always suitable for IV administration. In many cases, those IV forms are extended release. They're formulated in some kind of lipid emulsion, and those lipid emulsions cannot be given intravenously. They can cause serious problems if they are. So you want to check that before you take a medication that's for IM or that you know to be for IM, and then try to give it intravenously. Obviously you wouldn't do that without an order, but even if the doctor changes the route or the nurse practitioner changes the route, you want to make sure that that medication that was originally intended for IM use is actually okay to be given intravenously. Suspension settle. So if you've got oral liquids, you've always got to shake those well. Patches, again, kind of like those modified release oral medications, usually they can't be cut. There are a couple exceptions, so always check. Finally, dry powder inhalers. This is a new type of inhalation medication. These require the patient to be able to breathe in deeply. Unlike your MDI where you can just actuate it and let the patient kind of, breathe in and out, and eventually they'll get all the medication. Dry powder inhalers do require the patients to be able to actively inspire, so little kids probably won't be able to utilize those. So again, kind of in summary for this slide, these are really important take-home points. I think you guys should be familiar with this, obviously for the exam, but without a doubt for your clinical practice. Problems here could lead to death. So cutting or breaking a modified release tablet, that could cause all of the dose to be dumped at once. You know, if it's a blood pressure medication, the patient's blood pressure could drop precipitously, and that could lead to very serious problems for the patient. All right, so let's finish this up with some drug information stuff. In terms of drug information, there's lots of different resources out there. Obviously, primary literature, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with how to search the primary literature. Secondary literature, like textbook or review articles. I gotta tell you, our textbook for this course, I think it's phenomenal. It's new, it was just published last year. I think you guys will really like it. So it's a good source for drug information for you guys. Tertiary references like dictionaries or encyclopedias. There's also drug information centers. So hospitals historically had drug information centers where, you know, nurses or pharmacists or prescribers could just pick up a phone and call and ask somebody on the other line a question about a medication. These are really decreasing in availability across the country, and that's really because a lot of information is available online now. All of your hospitals are going to have access to multiple different types of drug information that, you know, rather than picking a phone up and calling somebody that's going to just look it up in a book, nowadays you can just kind of find that information on your own. A couple other things, Poison Control Center. So I have the number for the Maryland Poison Control Center listed on the slide, but also the patient. You know, honestly, patients and their family can be very good sources of drug information for you. Maybe not so much about how the drug works or what the expected side effects are, but they're going to be a good source of information for you about how the patient's taking the medication or maybe some adverse effects that the patient may be seeing. I mentioned those online resources, or these are also called drug monographs. LexiComp, Micromedics, Clinical Pharmacology, Up to Date. These are some of the ones that you guys may be familiar with. On the slide, I have the link for InsideHopkinsMedicine.org. This is the public workstation at Hopkins. I know you guys do clinicals over at Hopkins. You'll utilize this page quite a bit. On this slide, this is what that page looks like. You can see here I have some red boxes. Number one, over on the left-hand side, Micromedics. You guys will love that. That's a great drug resource if you haven't already used it. In the middle of the screen, you see the formulary. This is my personal favorite. I think it does all kinds of really cool stuff. I would encourage you guys to check that. Check out that drug info resource. It is called LexiComp, but at Hopkins, that's what they use to manage their formulary. So that's why on this slide it's listed as formulary. Scrolling down this page, so this is in the next slide, but all I did was scroll down the page on the Inside Hopkins Medicine public workstation homepage, and you can see down at the bottom there are a couple other resources. I think a couple good ones, Up to Date, Clinical Pharmacology. Those are others that I think that you guys might find useful. And that's really it. That's just, like I said, some background information. Hopefully you've chosen to listen to this lecture. Alternatively, you could just read the book. I think, you know, I really tried to summarize a couple chapters in your book, try to make that succinct for you guys so that you have less reading to do up front for the course. If you have any questions about this content, please post your questions on the discussion board under the Exam 1 content. And I'd be happy to answer those questions. And thank you for listening.